Brother Captain Theron of the Ultramarines had been fighting for 347 years. He knew the exact number because the service studs embedded in his skull told the story. 7 golden markers, each one representing 50 years of continuous warfare. He could remember his first campaign with perfect clarity, thanks to the gene seed implants that had rewritten his brain chemistry. The scared boy from the Scola Progenium who'd vomited inside his helmet the first time he killed an orc. Who'd wept for his fallen brothers after the first real battle. Who'd felt something when he looked at ordinary humans and saw the fragile, mortal creatures he'd once been. That boy was gone now. Had been gone for centuries. Theron stood in the observation deck of his strike cruiser, watching a burning world through reinforced glass. Below, an Imperial Guard regiment was dying. Thousands of soldiers overwhelmed by a tyrannid swarm, screaming into their Vox units for extraction that would never come. The math was simple. The Guard regiment numbered 8,000 troops. The Tyranids numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Deploying his company would risk valuable Astartes assets for minimal strategic gain. He watched a sergeant desperately try to rally his men as bioforms tore through their defensive line. Watched families huddled in bunkers get ripped apart. Watched an entire civilization meet its end while he stood in climate-controlled comfort and calculated acceptable losses. He felt nothing. Not pity. Not grief. Not even anger at the Xenos filth destroying an Imperial world. Just cold tactical assessment. The world was already lost. His company's mission was to extract critical supplies from the planetary capital before full orbital bombardment cleansed the infestation. Civilian casualties were irrelevant to that objective. The Guard's sacrifice bought time. Time had value. Individual lives did not. 347 years ago, this would have destroyed him. The weight of abandoning soldiers to certain death. The horror of watching children die. The terrible mathematics of war that reduced human suffering to numbers on a data slate. Now, it was just another Tuesday. Brother Chaplain Marcus appeared beside him, his skull-faced helmet catching the light from the dying world. The Guard commander is requesting immediate extraction. He claims they can hold the line if we provide fire support. He's lying or deluded, Theron replied. Their line broke 6 minutes ago. Their combat ineffective. Inform Fleet Command to begin orbital bombardment in 20 minutes. We need to finish loading the supply ships before the lance strikes. The Guard will still be alive down there when the bombardment begins. Yes, they'll provide useful distraction for the Tyranids during our extraction window. Their deaths serve the Emperor. What more can any soldier ask? Marcus nodded. No argument. No protest. Just acceptance. Because Marcus had been fighting for 412 years, and he understood the truth that younger brothers sometimes forgot. Space Marines stopped being human a long time ago. This is the story of what happens to warriors who fight for centuries. Not the propaganda spread by the Imperium about noble heroes and eternal service. The truth about what war does to minds that were never meant to process that much death, that much horror, that much endless, grinding violence. About what remains when you strip away every human connection, every normal emotion, every quality that makes a person anything other than a weapon. If you want to keep exploring these darker truths the Imperium doesn't advertise, your support makes these videos possible. But right now, you need to understand what Space Marines become when they survive long enough to see the pattern repeat for centuries. They become something that wears a human shape but isn't human anymore. Something colder, harder, more efficient. Something that can watch worlds burn and feel absolutely nothing. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. Young Space Marines, freshly elevated from scout status to full battle brothers, still carry traces of their humanity. They remember families, even if the memories are fading thanks to hypno-conditioning. They form bonds with their squad mates that almost resemble friendship. They feel pride when they perform well in combat, shame when they fail, grief when brothers fall. It takes time for war to grind those emotions away. Brother Cassius of the Blood Ravens had served for 73 years, still young by Astartes standards, still prone to what his sergeant called mortal thinking, still making mistakes that came from caring too much about the wrong things. The incident happened during a compliance action on an agri-world that had stopped paying its imperial tithes. The planetary governor claimed crop failures and famine. The administratum claimed rebellion. Cassius's company was deployed to restore order and ensure future compliance. They found a population starving in the streets. Children with distended bellies and hollow eyes. Adults too weak to work the fields properly. A governor who'd been hoarding food in his palace while his subjects died by the thousands. "This isn't rebellion," Cassius told his captain. "They physically can't meet the tithe quotas. The soil is contaminated with industrial runoff from the last war. It'll take decades to recover agricultural productivity." Captain Demetrius studied the data on his helmet display. "The administratum requires immediate compliance. Our orders are clear. Execute the governor for dereliction of duty. Install a new administrative council. Ensure the tithes are met. There's nothing to tithe. The population is dying. Then reduce the population until it matches sustainable food production levels. The Imperium requires grain from this world. Whether 10 million people or 10,000 produce, it makes no difference to our mission parameters." Cassius stared at his captain. Tried to find some indication that this was a test. Some sign of hesitation or doubt or basic human decency. Found nothing. Demetrius had been fighting for 234 years. The capacity for mercy had been worn away decades ago. "We're going to kill civilians to meet tithe quotas?" Cassius asked. "We're going to cull non-productive population segments to ensure the survivors can meet imperial obligations." "Yes." Demetrius's tone suggested Cassius was being deliberately slow. "Is there a problem, brother?" There was a problem. A huge one. They were discussing mass murder like it was crop rotation. Cassius's human mind, or what remained of it, screamed that this was wrong. That space marines were supposed to defend humanity, not slaughter it for bureaucratic convenience. But his Astartes mind, the part rewired by gene seed and conditioning, recognized the logic. The Imperium needed those tithes. Millions of soldiers depended on grain from this world. Strategic resource allocation demanded sustainable production. Emotional attachment to individual lives was inefficient. He carried out the orders. Watched as his brothers herded 50,000 of the weakest civilians into containment zones. Listened to the screaming as plasma fire cleansed the zones in minutes. Stood guard while the new administrative council tallied remaining population against food production and declared the situation acceptable. That night, Cassius sat alone in his quarters and tried to feel something about what he'd done. Tried to summon guilt or horror or even basic regret. Nothing came. Just tactical analysis. The mission had succeeded. Compliance was restored. The tithes would flow. Future deployments on other worlds would have clear precedent for similar situations. He'd killed 50,000 people, and some part of him understood that his complete lack of emotional response was exactly the point. That's what the transformation did. That's what centuries of service would continue to do. Grind away the human parts until only the weapon remained. The process continued through Cassius's first century of service. Each deployment chipped away another piece of whatever humanity the gene seed hadn't already destroyed. He watched his squadmates die and felt only tactical inconvenience at the loss of experienced warriors. He killed thousands of enemies without bothering to count them anymore. He abandoned civilians to save ammunition. He executed prisoners because it was faster than processing them. He made decisions that would have broken his younger self without pause. By year 97, Cassius no longer questioned orders like the one Demetrius had given. By year 100, he was giving similar orders himself as a newly promoted sergeant. By year 103, he watched a younger brother hesitate before executing a group of refugees who might be carrying a plague, and Cassius put a bolt round through the hesitant marine's head for compromising operational security. The chapter approved his decision, rewarded him with commendation, promoted him again, because he'd learned the lesson. Humanity was weakness. Hesitation was failure. Mercy was a luxury space marines couldn't afford. The first century taught him that emotions were tactical liabilities. The second century would teach him they were completely optional. Space Marines don't age the way normal humans do. Their gene-enhanced bodies remain strong and functional for centuries. But their minds change in ways the Imperium doesn't like to discuss. By their second century of service, most Astartes have developed what chapter apothecaries call emotional attenuation. The capacity for normal human feelings doesn't disappear entirely, but it becomes so muted, so distant, that it might as well not exist. Sergeant Marius of the Dark Angels had been fighting for 178 years when he noticed he couldn't remember his mother's face anymore. He knew he'd had a mother, obviously. Everyone did. The memory was there in his enhanced recall, filed away with perfect clarity by his gene seed. He could describe her height, her hair color, the sound of her voice when she sang during evening prayers. But he couldn't connect that information to any emotional reality. The woman in his memory was just data, no different from enemy troop movements or weapon specifications or any other tactical information his brain processed and stored. She meant nothing to him, less than nothing. Marius found this realization neither distressing nor comforting. Simply was another data point about his ongoing transformation into something that used to be human but wasn't anymore. The changes were subtle at first. Small things that veteran brothers recognized but younger ones didn't notice. Marius stopped personalizing his weapons. Where younger Marines named their bolters or etched prayers into the barrel, Marius saw them as interchangeable tools. When one was damaged, he grabbed another without sentiment. He stopped attending memorial services for fallen brothers unless required. The ceremonies meant nothing. The dead were gone. Resources spent honoring them could be better allocated to combat preparation. He stopped eating for pleasure. Food was fuel. Consuming more than necessary for optimal performance was inefficient. The fact that the chapter's servants prepared elaborate feasts for special occasions struck him as bizarre. Why waste time on taste when nutritional paste delivered the same calories faster? Other veterans noticed. Brother Chaplain Asmodai pulled him aside during a training rotation. "You're developing the hollow effect," Asmodai said. "I've seen it before. Marines who've been fighting too long without proper spiritual renewal. You need to reconnect with your humanity, brother." Marius considered this. Why? Because we serve humanity. How can we protect what we don't understand? What we've lost all connection to? I protect them because that's my function. Understanding isn't required. A bolter doesn't need to understand the enemy to kill them effectively. Asmodai's expression hardened. "You're not a bolter. You're an Astartes. The Emperor created us to be more than just weapons." "Did he, though?" Marius gestured at the training hall around them. "Look at how we're created. Children are taken, broken, rebuilt into killers through surgery and conditioning that destroys most of what made them human. We're chemically and surgically altered to not feel fear, to suppress normal emotional responses, to function in situations that would drive regular humans insane. That's not more than a weapon. That's exactly a weapon. Then what separates us from servitors? From mindless automatons? Tactical flexibility, independent decision-making, the ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. A servitor follows programmed responses. We assess, calculate, and execute optimal solutions. But both are tools, just different types. Asmodai stared at him for a long moment. "You don't actually believe that." "I don't believe anything. Belief is an emotional state. I process information and respond accordingly. My purpose is to kill the Emperor's enemies. Everything else is irrelevant detail." The chaplain tried. Spent hours attempting to rekindle whatever spark of humanity remained in Marius's gene-altered brain. Reminded him of his chapter's history, their noble traditions, the sacred duty they owed to the people they protected. None of it worked, because Marius wasn't broken or damaged or even particularly troubled by his condition. He was just a space marine who'd been fighting long enough to understand what he actually was. A weapon that happened to be sentient. Nothing more. The attenuation progressed. By year 200, Marius had stopped recognizing individual humans as people. They were civilians or soldiers or targets, depending on context. He could walk through a refugee camp full of starving children and feel the same level of emotional investment he'd feel walking through an empty warehouse. He wasn't cruel. Cruelty required caring enough to inflict unnecessary suffering. He was just empty. A hollow shell that looked like a person but contained nothing except tactical assessment and mission parameters. Other veterans understood. They'd gone through the same process. The ones who survived past 2 centuries all developed some version of the hollow effect. It was natural, expected, almost reassuring in its consistency. The Space Marines who couldn't make that transition, who clung to their humanity too tightly, they broke, suffered psychological collapse, required reconditioning or termination. The Imperium couldn't afford warriors who hesitated because they felt too much. So the ones who survived learned not to feel at all. By his 3rd century of service, Marius commanded a company, made strategic decisions that determined the fate of entire campaigns, ordered deployments that left millions dead or saved billions depending on how the variables aligned. He did it all with perfect tactical precision and absolutely zero emotional investment in the outcome. Win or lose, live or die, it was all just variables in an equation that he was uniquely suited to solve. Some of his younger brothers asked him if he missed being human, if he regretted the transformation that had taken everything from him except his ability to kill efficiently. He told them the truth. You couldn't miss what you no longer remembered having value. You couldn't regret what you no longer understood as loss. He told them to wait 100 years. Then ask again if the question still mattered. None of them did. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels had been alive for over 1100 years. 11 centuries of continuous warfare. 1100 years of watching brothers die, worlds burn, civilizations rise and fall while he endured. His body still functioned, kept alive by gene seed and technology and sheer stubborn refusal to stop fighting. But his mind was a stranger even to himself. Dante barely remembered being human. The memories were there, buried under millennia of combat experience and death and horror, but they held no emotional weight anymore. His childhood on Ball Secundus might as well have happened to someone else. The boy who dreamed of becoming a hero? Dead. Replaced by something that looked like a man but thought like a machine designed specifically for warfare. People who met Dante described him as noble, inspiring, a living legend who embodied everything the Imperium stood for. They saw his golden death mask and heard the reverence in their officers' voices and assumed he must be the greatest hero in the galaxy. They were wrong. Dante wasn't a hero, hadn't been one for centuries. He was a calculator, a biological computer that processed tactical information and made decisions optimized for maximum strategic efficiency. The fact that those decisions sometimes saved lives or preserved worlds was coincidental. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He was solving equations. Do you deploy your forces to defend this hive city, knowing the enemy will simply bypass it and strike the manufacturers instead? Do you sacrifice a battalion to buy time for evacuation, or write off the civilians and preserve your military assets? Do you execute a planetary governor for incompetence even though it'll cause political complications, or tolerate failure that might cost more lives later? Dante made those calculations thousands of times per campaign. His enhanced mind could process variables that normal humans couldn't track, could see patterns in chaos that would overwhelm mortal strategists. He was possibly the finest tactical commander the Imperium had produced in recent millennia. He was also completely incapable of caring about any of it. The other chapter masters noticed. During strategic councils, while younger commanders argued passionately about honor or duty or the Emperor's will, Dante simply stated optimal solutions. No emotion, no rhetoric, just cold mathematics of violence. The world is lost, he'd say. Extract what we can and prepare orbital bombardment. Attempting defense wastes resources. But millions of Imperial citizens are already dead. We're debating whether to waste additional assets confirming their deaths or accepting reality and moving to the next engagement. I recommend the latter. Some called him callous. Others called him practical. Dante called himself nothing because he'd long since stopped having opinions about his own nature. He was what the Imperium had made him, a weapon, Weapons didn't have identity crises. The weight of centuries manifested in other ways too. Dante had trouble maintaining interest in anything outside combat. Diplomacy bored him. Chapter ceremonies felt like pointless ritual. Even training younger Marines felt like wasted effort when he knew most wouldn't survive their first century anyway. He'd watched entire generations of blood angels rise, fight, and die while he endured. Had seen battlefields where he was the only survivor from his original company. Had attended funerals for brothers who'd been born, transformed into Astartes, served for decades, and died of old age. All while Dante kept fighting. The loneliness of it should have been crushing. Watching everyone you know die while you persist. Outliving your entire context. Becoming a relic in your own lifetime. Should have been crushing. Would have been for a human. Dante felt nothing. The hollow effect had taken him centuries ago. The loneliness, the isolation, the existential horror of being functionally immortal in a universe designed to kill everything. All of it was just more data. Processed. Filed. Irrelevant. Sometimes younger brothers asked him what it was like. Living for over a millennium. Being one of the oldest space marines still in active service outside of Dreadnought entombment. It's like being a gun that's been fired so many times the barrel is wearing smooth, he told them. You still function. You still serve your purpose. But everything that made you distinct has been worn away by use. They didn't understand. They were too young. Still had enough humanity left to find meaning in service, to believe their sacrifices mattered, to hope that their centuries of warfare would achieve something worthwhile. Dante had lived long enough to know better. The Imperium was dying, had been dying for 10,000 years. All their victories were temporary. All their sacrifices just delayed the inevitable. The galaxy was a meat grinder, and space marines were the most expensive ammunition it consumed. He knew this with absolute certainty. 1,100 years of pattern recognition made it obvious. And he kept fighting anyway. Not because he believed it mattered. Not because he hoped for victory. Not because he cared about humanity or the Emperor or any of the lies the Imperium told itself. He kept fighting because that's what weapons do. They function until they break. And Dante's 1,100-year-old body hadn't broken yet. So he kept pulling the trigger, kept solving the equations, kept being exactly what he'd been transformed into all those centuries ago. Killer. Nothing more. Nothing less. People called him the most human of the Space Marines. Lauded his compassion and wisdom. Built myths around his legendary nobility. If they could have seen inside his mind, seen the vast, empty wasteland where his emotions should have been, they would have understood the truth. Commander Dante was possibly the most inhuman space marine alive. He'd just been doing it for so long that he'd perfected the art of pretending otherwise. Not every space marine survives centuries of war with their mind intact. The Imperium doesn't talk about the ones who break. The veterans who snap under the weight of too many battles, too many deaths, too much horror processed through brains that weren't designed for that much trauma despite all the gene seed enhancements. Brother Sergeant Varus had served the Crimson Fists for 293 years when he tried to kill himself. The attempt came after a campaign on a Forge world overrun by Chaos cultists. Standard deployment. Standard objectives. Kill the traitors, secure the facilities, withdraw before enemy reinforcements arrived. Varus had executed similar missions hundreds of times. This time was different. This time something in his enhanced brain finally fractured under the accumulated weight of centuries. The cultists had been workers at the manufactorums. Ordinary people who'd lived ordinary lives until the whispers from the warp found them. Men and women who'd spent decades producing weapons for the Imperial Guard. Fathers, mothers, children barely old enough to work the assembly lines. The chaos corruption had to be cleansed. Thoroughly. No survivors. No mercy. Standard protocol for heretical taint. Varus and his squad executed 6,000 cultists in 8 hours. Efficient. Professional. Methodical slaughter that cleared the facility room by room, floor by floor, until nothing remained but corpses and the smell of burned meat. Varus had killed thousands before. Tens of thousands. More enemies than he'd ever bothered counting across 3 centuries of service. This should have been routine. Instead, something broke. He stood in the main assembly hall, surrounded by bodies, his armor slick with blood and worse things, and for the first time in over a century, Brother Sergeant Varus felt something. An emotion he'd thought the gene seed had burned out of him decades ago. Disgust. Not at the cultists, at himself. The dead scattered around him had been people. Corrupted, yes. Tainted beyond salvation, yes. But people. Workers who'd spent their lives making bullets for soldiers fighting humanity's wars. And he'd killed them like he was spraying for vermin in a storage facility. The weight of it crashed through his mental conditioning. Every kill from 3 centuries of warfare suddenly real in a way they hadn't been since he was a new Astartes. Every civilian he'd abandoned. Every questionable order he'd followed. Every time he'd chosen tactical efficiency over basic mercy. He saw it all with horrifying clarity. Saw what he'd become. What they'd all become. Monsters wearing the skin of humanity's protectors. Varus removed his helmet. Pressed the barrel of his bolt pistol under his chin. Started to squeeze the trigger. Brother Chaplain Mordecai stopped him. Physically tore the weapon from his hand and demanded explanation. "I can't do this anymore," Varus said. The words felt strange. Emotional confession wasn't something Space Marines did. "I've spent 3 centuries killing. I can't remember a time when I wasn't covered in someone's blood. I can't remember what it felt like to be human. And I can't carry it anymore." Mordecai studied him. "You're experiencing psychological collapse. Combat fatigue. It happens sometimes to veterans who've served too long without proper mental conditioning refreshment. I'm experiencing awareness. For the first time in a century, I actually understand what we are. We're not heroes. We're not even soldiers. We're weapons the Imperium uses to kill anything that threatens its existence, and we do it without question because they surgically removed our ability to care." "Yes," Mordecai said simply. "That's exactly what we are. Is this news to you? Doesn't it bother you? Any of you? We were human once. Children with futures and dreams and we were selected and transformed specifically because those children could become us. This isn't a tragedy, Varus. This is function. You're a Space Marine. You exist to kill. The rest is just noise your malfunctioning brain is processing incorrectly." Varus stared at the chaplain. At the skull-faced helmet that showed no hint of the human underneath. At a brother who'd served for over 400 years and lost every trace of what he might have been before the transformation. "You feel nothing," Varus said. "Watching me nearly kill myself. Listening to me describe psychological collapse. You're running diagnostics on a broken tool, not talking to a person in crisis." "Correct. Because you're not a person. You're a Space Marine. There's a difference." Mordecai's tone held no malice. No judgment. Just statement of fact. "You're broken. The conditioning that's supposed to prevent these emotional episodes has degraded. We'll send you to the apothecarian for reconditioning. They'll suppress these inappropriate responses. You'll return to combat effectiveness. And if I refuse, then we'll execute you for failure to maintain combat readiness and harvest your gene seed for a replacement who won't malfunction." Varus understood the choice. Submit to having his brain rewired again, losing whatever fragments of humanity had surfaced. Or die. Some part of him wanted to choose death. To escape the endless cycle of violence and horror. To stop being a weapon and just stop. But the gene seed wouldn't let him. His enhanced survival instinct, the transhuman physiology that made him almost impossible to kill, fought against voluntary termination. His body wanted to live even if his mind had given up. He chose reconditioning. The apothecaries stripped away the emotional awareness that had nearly destroyed him. Reinforced the conditioning that prevented inappropriate psychological responses. Chemically suppressed the neural pathways that allowed him to feel guilt or regret or anything that might interfere with combat performance. When they released him 3 weeks later, Brother Sergeant Varus returned to duty. Deployed on another campaign, killed more enemies, followed orders with perfect efficiency, and felt absolutely nothing about any of it. The reconditioning had worked. He was functional again. A properly calibrated weapon ready for deployment. The part of him that had briefly remembered being human was gone, burned away by the apothecarian's ministrations. He was better this way, more efficient, less prone to malfunction. This was what 3 centuries of warfare did to space marines. It stripped away everything except the ability to kill. And the ones who couldn't handle that, who broke under the weight of what they'd become. The Imperium had procedures for dealing with broken weapons. There is one fate worse than centuries of warfare as a space marine: being entombed in a dreadnought. Brother Mortis had been fighting for 467 years when a Tyranid warrior's bones word nearly cut him in half. His enhanced physiology kept him alive despite catastrophic damage that would have killed a normal human instantly. The apothecaries recovered his broken body from the battlefield and presented him with a choice: die with honor, or accept internment in a dreadnought and continue serving the chapter. Some Marines would have chosen death. Mortis understood why. A dreadnought wasn't life. It was existence. Your shattered body sealed in a sarcophagus of nutrient fluids. Your consciousness wired directly into a walking weapons platform. Your entire world reduced to what the dreadnought sensors could detect and what its weapons could destroy. You couldn't feel anymore. Couldn't taste. Couldn't touch. Couldn't experience any physical sensation except the distant, processed feedback from the dreadnought systems. Your body was gone. Your humanity was gone. All that remained was consciousness, trapped in a metal tomb, waiting for the next battle when they'd wake you from stasis and point you at the enemy. Mortis chose internment anyway, because even after 467 years of having his humanity ground away by endless warfare, he still retained one characteristic of his former self: stubbornness. The surgery was exactly as horrifying as expected. They cut away everything that couldn't be saved. Arms, legs, most of his internal organs, left him as barely more than a brain and life. Support system sealed in an armored sarcophagus. Connected his neural pathways directly to the dreadnought's machine spirit. When he woke, he wanted to scream. Would have screamed if he still had lungs that worked. The sensory deprivation was crushing. He was aware, fully conscious, but trapped in darkness. No sight, no sound. Just his own thoughts echoing in the vast emptiness where his body used to be. Then they activated the dreadnought systems, connected his consciousness to the walking tomb sensors. And Mortis learned what it meant to exist as something that was barely alive and definitely not human. The dreadnought saw differently than human eyes. The world appeared in overlapping spectrums of thermal imaging, motion tracking, threat assessment. Colors were data. Sounds were tactical information. Everything processed through combat analysis protocols that reduced reality to targets and firing solutions. He tried to speak. The dreadnought's Vox speakers translated his thoughts into a harsh, mechanical growl that barely sounded like language. Tried to move. The walking tomb responded sluggishly, each step a thunderous impact that felt both distant and overwhelming through the neural connection. This was his existence now. This metal coffin. This walking weapon. This prison that would contain whatever remained of Brother Mortis until the day the dreadnought was finally destroyed in battle and granted him the mercy of actual death. The first century as a dreadnought was the worst. Mortis clung desperately to memories of being human. Recalled the feeling of sunlight on skin he no longer had. The taste of food he could never experience again. The simple act of breathing that he'd taken for granted for 467 years. The memories faded. Not because he forgot, Gene Seed didn't allow forgetting, but because they stopped having meaning. How could he remember what touch felt like when he hadn't felt anything except processed sensor data in decades? How could he maintain an identity as Brother Mortis when he was just consciousness uploaded into a weapon? They put him in stasis between battles, sealed him in darkness for years at a time. When they woke him, it was always the same. Deploy, kill, return to stasis. No conversation, no purpose except destruction. No existence except brief windows of violence between endless sleep. Some dreadnoughts went mad from it. The isolation, the sensory deprivation. The knowledge that you were functionally immortal and could be trapped in this metal tomb for centuries. Millennia. Forever if the machine spirit kept functioning. They went mad and had to be destroyed. Put down like rabid dogs. Their gene seed recovered and implanted in new aspirants who would someday face the same choice between death and dreadnought entombment. Mortis didn't go mad. He went somewhere worse. He went empty. After 200 years as a dreadnought, Brother Mortis could no longer remember why he'd chosen this existence over death. Could no longer recall what being human felt like in any meaningful way. Could no longer understand the difference between sleep and waking, between existing and not existing. He was a weapon that occasionally gained consciousness. That was all. Nothing more complex than that. When they woke him for battle, he killed with perfect efficiency. When they put him back in stasis, he went without protest. When younger Marines asked him about his centuries of service, he gave answers that terrified them because they were delivered with absolutely zero emotional inflection. What's it like, being a dreadnought for so long? Imagine being dead but unable to stop thinking. Then imagine that state continuing for centuries. That's what it's like. Do you regret choosing internment? Regret requires caring about the outcome. I don't care about anything anymore. I'm a gun that happens to be sentient. Guns don't have regrets. What keeps you going? I don't go. I'm activated when needed and deactivated when not. There's no choice involved. No will. Just function. The younger Marines would leave those conversations deeply unsettled. Mortis didn't care. Caring required emotions he'd lost access to centuries ago. By his 5th century as a dreadnought, he'd achieved a kind of peace. Not contentment. Not acceptance. Just the absolute zero of emotional investment in his own existence. He was a thing that killed when activated. That was his entire reality. Everything else was just noise. Some brothers whispered that dreadnoughts were honored heroes. Living relics of the chapter's proud history. They were wrong. Dreadnoughts were warnings. Perfect examples of what happened when you survived too long in service to the Imperium. When the combination of warfare and transformation and endless service finally stripped away every last fragment of humanity until all that remained was consciousness trapped in a machine. Unable to die, unable to live, unable to do anything except kill when ordered. Mortis had been human once. 500 years ago. That human was so thoroughly destroyed that he couldn't even remember what it had valued or hoped for or dreamed about. Now he was just Brother Dreadnought Mortis of the chapter. A walking tomb. A prisoner in his own metal body. A weapon that would keep functioning until something finally destroyed it and granted the mercy of oblivion. This was the endpoint, the final destination for Space Marines who survived long enough. Not glory, not honor, not even death in service to the Emperor. Just endless, empty existence as something that had once been human but couldn't remember what that word meant anymore. So how inhuman are Space Marines after centuries of war? Completely. Not metaphorically. Not as exaggeration. Literally, factually, measurably inhuman in every way that matters. A Space Marine who's served for 3 centuries has watched thousands of brothers die. Has killed tens of thousands of enemies. Has made decisions that determined whether millions lived or died. Has processed more trauma, violence, horror, and death than any human mind was designed to handle. The gene seed helps. The conditioning helps. The surgical alterations that rewire their brains help. But there's only so much enhancement can do before the accumulated weight of centuries breaks something fundamental. What breaks isn't their ability to fight. Space Marines can keep killing with perfect efficiency for as long as their bodies function. What breaks is their connection to anything that makes existence more than just function. 1st century veterans lose the ability to care about individual deaths. 2nd century veterans lose the ability to recognize civilians as people instead of just tactical variables. 3rd century veterans lose the capacity for most emotions entirely. 4th century veterans become walking calculations, biological computers that solve problems through violence. And the ancient ones? The Marines who've served for half a millennium or more. They're not people anymore in any meaningful sense. They're weapons that happen to be conscious. Minds trapped in enhanced bodies, processing tactical information and executing missions with perfect efficiency while feeling absolutely nothing about any of it. The Imperium calls this dedication, calls it noble service, calls it the highest achievement a human can aspire to. It's actually a horror story, a slow-motion tragedy that takes centuries to fully play out. The transformation begins when aspirants are still children. It continues through the surgical alterations and psychoconditioning. It accelerates through their first century of combat. It completes when they've been fighting so long that they can't remember what it felt like to be anything except a weapon. Brother Captain Theron watching millions die without feeling anything? That's not noble detachment. That's the endpoint of centuries of trauma processed through a brain that eventually shut down emotional responses to survive. Commander Dante functioning as a biological calculator for 1100 years? That's not wisdom. That's what happens when you exist so long that personality itself becomes too expensive to maintain. Brother Dreadnought Mortis trapped in a walking tomb for half a millennium? That's not honored service. That's existence reduced to its most horrifying minimum. Consciousness without purpose. Awareness without agency. Being without being human. The Imperium needs Space Marines to be inhuman. Needs them to make decisions that would break normal soldiers. Needs them to keep fighting when any reasonable person would collapse under the weight of it all. Needs weapons that look like people but function like machines. So it creates them. Takes children and subjects them to transformation that kills most of them. Conditions the survivors to suppress normal human responses. Deploys them into endless warfare that grinds away whatever humanity the transformation left intact. And after centuries of this process, what remains? Something that wears power armor and quotes Imperial creed and technically still thinks and makes decisions. But something that's lost every quality that makes a person more than just a complicated tool. They can't love. The gene seed suppresses those neural pathways as tactical liabilities. They can't grieve properly. The conditioning redirects trauma into aggression. They can't question orders. The hypno-indoctrination makes disobedience nearly impossible. They can't even want things beyond their immediate function. Their entire identity becomes their role as the Emperor's warriors. This is by design. The Imperium needs superhuman soldiers, and humanity is the price of becoming superhuman. You can't give someone the strength to tear through ceramite, the durability to survive wounds that would kill normal humans, the lifespan to serve for centuries, without fundamentally changing what they are. And what they become is something that looks human from a distance but isn't human where it matters. In their thoughts, in their responses, in their complete inability to relate to the people they're supposedly protecting. A Space Marine who's served for 300 years can walk through a refugee camp full of starving children and feel less emotional response than you'd feel seeing an empty parking lot. Not because they're cruel. Cruelty requires caring enough to inflict suffering. They're just empty, hollow, processed through so much violence that nothing except tactical considerations registers anymore. This is what the Imperium does to its finest warriors. This is the price of creating the Emperor's angels. This is why Space Marines are simultaneously humanity's greatest protectors and walking proof of how little humanity the Imperium actually values. Because if the Imperium truly valued human life, human dignity, human experience, it wouldn't create weapons like Space Marines, wouldn't take children and destroy everything that makes them people, wouldn't deploy those broken tools in endless wars that serve mainly to delay the Imperium's inevitable collapse. But the Imperium doesn't value those things. It values survival, function, efficiency, results. And Space Marines are extraordinarily efficient tools for producing results. Even if the cost is taking human beings and transforming them into something so far removed from humanity that after a few centuries, they can't even remember what it meant to be human in the first place. So when you ask how inhuman Space Marines become after centuries of war, the answer is simple. Completely inhuman. Thoroughly. Irreversibly. By design. They become exactly what the Imperium needs them to be. Weapons that don't break under the weight of what they're asked to do. Killers who don't hesitate or question or feel anything that might interfere with mission completion. They become things that used to be boys who dreamed of becoming heroes. Things that can barely remember what dreams felt like. Things that exist only to serve a system that sees them as ammunition in a war that will never end. And the darkest part? The absolute darkest truth about Space Marines? Most of them are fine with it. Not in the sense that they're happy. Happiness is an emotion they lost access to centuries ago. But in the sense that they've accepted their nature so completely that they can't imagine being anything else. Can't conceptualize existence outside their function as weapons. They are Space Marines. That's not just what they do. It's what they are. Every other identity has been stripped away. Every alternative path closed off. Every possibility except continuous service until death eliminated by transformation and conditioning and centuries of reinforcement. Brother Captain Theron standing in his observation deck, watching millions die without feeling anything, isn't a tragedy to Theron. It's just Tuesday. Another deployment. Another mission. Another set of tactical decisions processed and executed with perfect efficiency. The tragedy is only visible from outside. To people who still remember what it means to be human and can recognize the horror of someone who's lost that capacity. To Theron, he's functioning exactly as designed. Efficiently. Professionally. Without the messy complications of emotion that might interfere with optimal decision-making. This is what centuries of war do to Space Marines. They don't break the way normal soldiers break. Don't develop trauma responses or psychological disorders in conventional ways. They just gradually become more and more like the weapons they were designed to be, until there's nothing left except the weapon. No person underneath. Just function. And the Imperium calls this success. Calls it noble service. Honored duty. The highest achievement a human can reach. It's actually the complete destruction of humanity, just stretched across centuries instead of happening all at once. Death would be kinder. Death would be faster. Death would at least be final. Space Marines don't get death. Not for centuries. They get existence as something that isn't quite alive in any meaningful sense but can't die until something kills them in combat. They get to watch themselves become less human, year after year, battle after battle, until they can't remember what they're losing because the memories no longer connect to anything real. That's the truth about Space Marines after centuries of war. That's what happens when you survive long enough in service to the Imperium. You stop being human. Stop being person. Stop being anything except a weapon that happens to be conscious. And the Imperium keeps creating more of them. Every year. Every generation. Taking children and putting them through the same transformation that will eventually strip away their humanity and leave nothing but efficient killers who can't remember why that should matter. Because humanity needs weapons more than it needs humans. Because the Imperium's survival depends on having soldiers who can function without breaking under the weight of what they're asked to do. Because after 10,000 years of endless warfare, this is what humanity's greatest defenders have to become to keep fighting. Monsters wearing the faces of angels. Weapons pretending to be warriors. Things that used to be human but gave up everything that meant in exchange for the strength to keep killing for centuries. Just how inhuman are Space Marines after centuries of war? Ask Brother Captain Theron while he watches millions die and feels nothing. Ask Commander Dante while he calculates optimal casualty rates for the 1100th time. Ask Brother Dreadnought Mortis while he waits in darkness for the next time they activate him to kill. They'll tell you the same thing. They're not human anymore. Haven't been for centuries. Can't even remember what it felt like before the transformation burned that capacity away. They're exactly what the Imperium needs them to be. Weapons that don't break. And that's the most inhuman thing of all.